Before we start, at the end of this video, I'm going to ask you to vote on which design you think should be my next sewing pattern, so stay tuned for that. In 1942, a French couturier was denounced by one of her investors as being a Jew, and she slapped him in public. Then she opened a new fashion house, naming it after her estranged husband, and spent the occupation finding ways around Nazi fabric restrictions to keep making the most extraordinary dresses in Paris. Her name was Madame Grès. The New York Times called her fashion house the most intellectual place in Europe to buy clothes. She wanted to be a sculptor, but her family said no, so she spent the next 6 decades proving that fabric could do everything that stone could. And today I'm trying her method, and on a mannequin that is a laser-cut replica of my body. And it's to design the Esther, my next sewing pattern. So once you understand what Madame Grès was doing, you can't unsee it, so let's get started. But before we do that, who was Madame Grès? Her real name was Germaine Emily Krebs, born on the 30th of November 1903 in the Tenay neighborhood of Paris's 17th arrondissement. Not a bourgeois family, her parents ran a pipe making workshop in one of the covered passageways of Paris, which was very typical at the turn of the century. So she dreamed of being a sculptor, but her father refused, but then later conceded enough to let her take drawing lessons. And then a few sewing lessons later, she realized that fabric was her medium. She looked at it as living sculpture, and she left home as a minor to escape an arranged marriage, but completely uncertain what she was going to do with her life, but she knew it involved fabric. By around 1920, she was working as part of the millinery department at Le Bon Marché in Paris. By 1924, she had joined Maison Premiette on Place Vendôme, one of the most celebrated couture houses in Paris. And there's something really cool about Maison Premiette that not a lot of people know. Premiette was founded by a woman, most likely her name was Madeleine Premiette, and throughout its entire history, every successive designer after she passed away was also a woman, not one male creative director. It was women all the way through. And the woman running it when Madame Grès arrived was Mademoiselle Charlotte Rainville, who was described in the Rizzoli monograph of Madame Grès as her formidable and capricious boss. But Charlotte, who was a designer at the time, has her own iconic story. Because in 1922, Premiette's head designer created a little black dress. Black satin, white collar, white cuff. It was called La Garçon, and Vogue called it the most celebrated single dress the world ever knew. Women's Wear Daily called it the most copied and talked about dress of the 1920s. Fashion historian Valerie Steele documented it achieving, and I'm quoting, the most sensational success reached by any individual dress model of recent years, counting both licensed and illegitimate reproduction. 1 million garçons were sold over the earth. Chanel's little black dress appeared in Vogue 4 years later, in 1926. Now we know Chanel's version had a genuine cultural impact, and fashions historian described her role accurately as the strongest voice in the choir. Not the inventor, not the individual that created it, but as the strongest voice in the group. But Premiette got there first, and almost no one knows about it. So Germaine Krebs worked under Charlotte at Premiette, rising to premier modeliste, the first designer pattern maker, by the late 1920s. And then she left to go solo. By 1930, she cast off her name as Germaine and became Alix, A-L-I-X. And by 1934, Maison Alix was selling on the other side of the Atlantic. Her dresses were actually at Macy's. Vogue crowned her couture's successor to antiquity. One advertisement for Maison Alix consisted simply of a photograph of the Acropolis caryatids with their classical form-fitting drapery. She earned the nickname Spécialiste de drape, the draping specialist. And she was 30 years old. At the opening reception of a film in a neighboring gallery, she met a Russian painter named Serge Anatolievich Cherevkov, and she fell hopelessly in love. They married in 1937, and the name Grès is a partial anagram of Serge. So she rearranged the letters of his name into her professional identity. Grès also means sandstone in French. So this whole connection between her wanting to originally be a sculptor and then assuming that name within her professional identity is just a really interesting connection. And in 1938, despite her fashion house bringing in millions, she discovered that she was still only on salary. So she threatened to walk out and they gave her half her shares. In 1939, she gave birth to her daughter Anne, but she covered up the pregnancy and lost herself in her work. She kind of was sensing that war was coming. She was abandoned by her husband. He had gone away to spend time in Tahiti, and she gave birth just as the conflict was about to break out. The German forces marched on Paris in 1940, and she fled to Sombiat in the French Pyrenees with her daughter and her parents. She set up a makeshift workshop and kept sending pieces to Paris across the demarcation line that split the country in two. In 1942, she was denounced as a Jew by one of her investors. She sold her shares at Maison Alix and she slapped her informer across the face in public. She was devastated losing the name that made her famous, and she thought briefly about abandoning the profession entirely because of that. Couturier Lucien Lelong, president of the Chambre syndicale de la couture parisienne, persuaded her that would be an irrational decision. So she came back and she found a property at number 1 Rue de la Paix, and she opened the House of Grès on August 1st, 1942, with its salons decorated entirely in off-white. In January 1944, the Vichy government shut her workshops down by order as an example. Jean Cocteau and Christian Bérard circulated a petition, so she was allowed to reopen in March on the condition that she adapted her draping technique to comply with Nazi fabric restrictions. And yet she found ways around it. And when Paris was liberated, she welcomed American soldiers into her home. She said, "I don't have a private life as such. I dedicate myself entirely to my couture house and the people working there. The creative act remains for me the sole means of addressing those concerns. Each day would be identical to the one before, and my family certainly must have suffered from that." She named her first ever perfume Cabochard. It was released in 1959, and it means pig-headed or stubborn in French. At this point, she had been in couture for 3 decades, and she named the perfume after her own personality. And it was actually a financial godsend that really saved her business at the time. In 1970, she was elected unanimously as the president of the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture, the governing body of French fashion. And that same year, her estranged husband died in Tahiti. But she kept wearing her wedding ring as a talisman to the very end. Now, I have the Rizzoli book here of her life and her work. And although she was famous for draping directly onto the body, she did do some beautiful sketches that you can see here. And you can see how many times she's worked over the lines just to get that beautiful drape and movement. She said, "I never create a dress on the basis of a sketch. I drape the fabric on a mannequin and then I examine its character and depth. And that's when I pick up my scissors. Cutting is the critical and most important stage in creating a dress. For every collection that I produce, I completely wear out 3 pairs of scissors." And when she was given the Golden Thimble Award in 1976, couture's highest honor, she waved the Cartier-made trophy in the air and announced, "I never had any others. I hate sewing. I never sew." But here's what made Grès different from almost every other couturier in her era. She didn't work from patterns. She didn't make toiles or samples. She just took fabric and draped it directly onto the body. And the dress was made directly for that person, directly onto their body. So the body was the pattern. And she was notoriously secretive about her process and how she did it. She never explained her technique. She never wrote it down. And she earned the nickname the Sphinx of Fashion because she refused to reveal how any of it worked. And her favorite fabric was silk jersey. A single dress could take between 13 and 21 meters of fabric. That's roughly between 14 to 23 yards. Her pleating could reduce 270 centimeters of fabric, about 9 feet, into just 7 centimeters. 2.7 meters into 7 centimeters, and up to 300 hours per dress. every single pleat done by hand. And because of her obsessive fear about being copied, she would apparently take rough mock-ups home and hang them on wooden mannequins within her apartment so she could rework them and refine them in isolation without anyone ever seeing them if she wasn't there. And she called ready-to-wear fashion a prostitution. That is a direct quote from her. But she was the last haute couture house to introduce it. And that absolute refusal to compromise is exactly what destroyed her financially. And one more thing before I move on to the mannequin and draping is that in 1954, the Ford Institution sent Madame Grès to India to study textile crafts. The influence of Indian clothing, the drape, the wrap, the garment that begins with the body instead of a pattern really runs through her later collections. And I've been researching for the last 6 months all about textile crafts and the origin of clothing and drape and cloth and sacred textile traditions all through Asia and Africa and Europe. And it was so cool that Madame Grès went there and learned all of that. And I totally get why. It is the origin of draping, which brings me to this. This is my Mimiquins mannequin. And thank you to Mimiquins for partnering with me on this video. Now, this is definitely not a standard dress form. This is actually a laser cut replica of my actual body. I actually got my body digitally scanned earlier this year, and they have created this incredible dressmaking mannequin that is identical to my arms, my entire body, my proportions, my posture, everything. So when I come to drape on this, I'm actually draping on myself. And Madame Grès worked on live forms and custom made forms of her clients as well. She had no interest in hypothetical standardized forms. She wanted the actual body that the dress was being made for. And this is the most modern expression of the same principle. A laser cut exact replica of my body. She would have totally understood this. And seeing your body from the outside is a really strange experience. In the video that I originally posted when I first unwrapped my Mimiquins mannequin, it took me a bit to really kind of process it. It was a very emotional experience. I think a lot of women have a complex relationship with their body, and getting this mannequin really genuinely healed something within me. I think as dressmakers, a lot of the time we have standardized mannequins around us, and we know that once we fit it on that, we're going to have to adjust it and alter it to whatever the unique aspects of our own body are. So to actually have a mannequin that I look at all the time, that's right there in the corner of my eye, it's helped me just get used to what I actually look like, as opposed to this kind of body dysmorphia that a lot of us have, and thinking that we need to fit into a certain stock standard silhouette. So yeah, I'm really excited to work on this mannequin. So thank you, Mimiquins, for sponsoring this video. And this pattern being named the Esther pattern from a painting that's currently at the NGV in Melbourne, where I live. And the interesting thing is that there is actually a Madame Grès dress that is at the NGV as well. So it's so incredible that my favorite painting and one of my favorite designers' dresses is in the same building. So I need to go back and see both of them ASAP. Now I'm working with this medium weight kind of slub interlock jersey for my sampling process. It is definitely nowhere near as fine as a silk jersey that Madame Grès would have worked with, but it's going to give me the same kind of idea of what the silhouette will look like. And I guess what customers can expect just getting a normal jersey at their fabric store. I think the Esther will be created in a viscose jersey towards the end, which has a really beautiful drape. So I'm looking forward to sampling it in other fiber content types of jerseys. Okay, let's get started on the 3 silhouettes, and leave your favorite in the comment section below so I can get an idea of what you guys love as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with the design that I love the most and see how we go from there. So I've just added on a little bit of elastic on the back and stretched it out and then brought it back in, so it's already creating that kind of raglan seam that I've created in the design. So let's have a look. Here are some fun facts about Madame Grès that I'll read to you while I actually drape on the mannequin. So apparently she drove a blue Jaguar with the seats upholstered in mink and had a television installed in the car, but she never actually watched it. One leisure pursuit she had was walking around flea markets in silence, in a faded raincoat and accompanied only by her Pekingese dog named Music, apparently described in the Rizzoli book I have as horrible. She loved furniture from the Haute Epoque, roughly the Middle Ages to the 17th century, and the 17th century Dutch paintings and Byzantine crosses. She had two Byzantine crosses at her couture house, one for fine dressmaking and one for tailoring, one at the boutique and one at home. Apparently, she would double lock the doors for the duration of her shows so the audience could focus entirely on the ceremony of the dresses walking down the runway. She personally greeted and thanked every person invited to be the first to view her collections, and she described solitude as necessary and overwhelming. Some of her silk and metallic lame fabrics were made in 1938 by Bianchini Ferreira. No more than 7 centimetres could be produced per day. She would ask fabric manufacturers like Rodier or Col Combet to double the initial width of jersey fabric, specifically to avoid superfluous seams, so she didn't have to make any seams. She had antique Ottoman silks woven to order. Her jersey fabric names were almost poetic. Josephine, Jacille, de Satamix, all made in broad widths specifically for her. She described her collections from the point of view of the relationship between designer and body. Her lines were called gélissances. That's terrible pronunciation, but apparently it meant spurting or gushing. Another one was called lions, creepers. Another one was called enveloppants, enveloping or enveloping, or accorps perdu, headlong. She made costumes for Circe and Penelope in the 1954 film Ulysses, starring Kirk Douglas. And given the Odyssey research that I've been doing a lot lately for the Goddess project, it's really, really cool. And the photos are on my Substack if you want to have a look. Ezzedine Elia amassed 900 of her creations, 900 pieces. He collected her work obsessively. And there was an exhibition at Ezzedine Elia Foundation in Paris in 2023 to 2024. I know it might seem weird to get emotional about it, but Madame Grès has been one of my favorite designers for a very long time, and I've never tried to kind of attempt what she does because it was always just an inspiration for me, to something to look at to go, oh, that's just incredible, and to kind of leave it as hers. But I think I can really understand the beauty in what she did through doing it. There's something so different about draping directly onto the body, and in this case, directly onto my own body on this mannequin, that helps me understand true design. So, true design is about not just a standalone garment that is just beautiful in itself, but something that personifies the wearer, something that follows their lines, their silhouette, their movement, their body. And this is the technique to do that in, because you're following what the fabric is telling you to do, what lines it wants to follow. It's like this kind of back and forth between what you want to do and then what the fabric's telling you and what the body's telling you. It's like this kind of 3-part symbiotic relationship between you, the fabric, and the form. And I'm just like, yeah, I get it. Anyway, moving on. She dressed Jackie Kennedy anonymously because Kennedy didn't want anyone to know. She loaned a wedding gown to photographer William Klein for his satirical film about the fashion world called Who Are You, Polly Magoo? She called herself an ouvrière en chambre, a home worker, despite running one of the most prestigious couture houses in the world. She reproached her contemporaries for relying on drawings and illustrations, calling superficial, showy ideas the source of haute couture's decline, while those same contemporaries' houses are still standing today, whereas hers is not as much. while simultaneously the most awarded and most financially disastrous couturier of her generation. She liked two other designers, Balenciaga and Yves Saint Laurent. Cristobal Balenciaga sought employment from her when he fled Spain during the Spanish Civil War. They're all the fun facts I've got for you now, and now we're going to get on to voting for which design you like the most. But one more step before we do that. Before the vote, let's talk about the end of Madame Grès' story. Grès was a genius with fabric, but a disaster with money. She said in 1977, "I cannot think about business or cost when I am designing a dress. I don't look at the price of any of the fabrics I use. I don't care." And that was 11 years before her house went under. She used up to 59 meters, about 65 yards, for one dress. And she lost a lawsuit against the American distributor of her perfume Cabochard and was ordered to pay 10 million francs. And then the licensing deals continued to go badly. In 1984, she partnered with businessman Bernard Tapie, who bought more than half her business. In 1986, the house was expelled from the Chambre syndicale for failure to pay its dues. And in 1987, she filed for bankruptcy after 2 years of unpaid rent. Her premises at 1 Rue de la Paix were cleared, all her assets were sold off, and she had to watch her entire life's work spread out on the ground outside. She retired to St. Paul de Vence with her daughter, and eventually she got moved to a low-income retirement home. And then, secretly, Hubert de Givenchy, Pierre Cardin, and Yves Saint Laurent paid her rent. They helped her find an apartment in Paris so she could keep sewing for friends in a small way. The three most powerful men in French fashion paid her rent in secret, and nobody talked about it. She died on November the 24th, 1993 in total solitude. And her death wasn't made public for over a year. It was revealed on the front page of Le Monde on the 14th of December 1994, only after the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York had already held a retrospective exhibition in her honor called Great Grès. So weirdly, New York paid homage to her before Paris even knew she was gone. She spent 300 hours on a single dress. She wore out 3 pairs of scissors per collection. She slapped the man who denounced her. She worked until midnight every night. She said the creative act was her only way of addressing her concerns. And she kept her estranged husband's name and his wedding ring until the end. And she never explained how she did any of it. This is the woman whose method I tried today. So 3 options. Vote in the comments. Thank you to Mimiquins for making this possible, for making me a form that is my exact body. I'll link it below. The Goddess Project is where all of this lives, right here on YouTube. I'll link my Instagram, my Substack, and my podcast, The Culture of Cloth. Thank you for watching.